Hi, so welcome back to my video series on why people support or oppose the Me Too movement and feminist movements more generally. This video is going to be a little different than the last one, specifically because we're going to be talking about something else, so not system justification theory. In addition, I'm going to be introducing the relevant study first this time rather than the theory, and then that will segue into the theory. So with that being said, let's get going. So Kunst et al., this was an article that was published 1 year after Me Too kind of caught fire. And essentially what they were interested in was they wanted to look at whether men and women differed in terms of their ideas about Me Too and their support for Me Too and their beliefs about Me Too. But they also wanted to take into account cross-cultural differences. So the way they worded it was they looked at a highly gender egalitarian nation in Norway, and they looked at a country that isn't as gender egalitarian in the United States, which they considered to be more average on this particular factor. And what they did was they measured men and they measured participants' attitudes towards Me Too and attitudes and behaviors in numerous other areas, for example, rape myths, pornography consumption, etc. And this is what they found. Men view Me Too as less positive and more harmful than do women. So this was the case in both Norway and the United States, which I think is really important here. Basically, they explain how it's more of a difference of ideologies than it is about group differences. So basically, in other words, men as a group are more consistent regardless of whether they're from Norway or the United States, and it isn't so much where they're coming from that's influencing those thoughts. I think this study kind of embodies the best and the worst of what I've already talked about with regard to the other studies, the Kenda et al. And the Young et al. Study, in that it does take advantage of cross-cultural research, so we're getting away from the weird sample, so to speak, but it also does use, as measures of behavior, self-report, which, I mean, you can't really observe somebody's pornography consumption. That would be unethical, but it's not necessarily the same act asking somebody how much pornography they consume. Those are two different things, behaviors and attitudes, and we've talked about that already. So I want to just highlight the reasons why Kunst et al. Found, or why they thought that men and women scored differently in terms of positivity and thoughts about harmfulness of the movement. So there were three particular reasons why Kunst et al. Thought that men scored in this way and women scored in the way they scored. First off, hostile sexism. Men tend to score higher in hostile sexism than do women. Then there was rape myth acceptance. Men tend to score higher in rape myth acceptance than do women. And finally, there was feminist identification. Essentially, women were more likely to identify as feminists. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time talking about feminist identification. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. It's fairly intuitive. If you're identifying as a feminist, you are more likely to support feminist movements like Me Too. However, I do want to spend some time talking about hostile sexism because it relates to intergroup biases, which is a topic we'll be talking about later in the course. And I'd like to talk about rape myth acceptance because I just find it really interesting. I want you guys to know a little bit about it. And I found this really cool connection to one of the podcasts that Yasser is going to be talking about this week. Or potentially talking about this week. It was one of the assigned readings or podcasts, I suppose. So with that being said, we're going to move straight into hostile sexism. So what exactly is hostile sexism, and what is sexism more generally? Hostile sexism is a form of bias. I'd like to provide a definition that we'll actually encounter later in the term, and it's provided by Davidio and Gartner in the handbook chapter on intergroup biases, and it essentially says that bias is defined broadly as an unfair evaluative, emotional, cognitive, or behavioral response towards another group. So essentially, biases encompass prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes. Biases are the more general, overarching term that encompass all those smaller categories. For example, discrimination typically is a behavioral response towards another group. So, based on this definition of bias, sexism would be an unfair evaluative, emotional, cognitive, or behavioral response towards women enacted by men. Now, there's two types of sexism that I would like to identify for you. First, there's hostile sexism, and hostile sexism has been defined as kind of egregious and blatantly misogynistic, and it views women as sexually manipulative or inferior, and I think that inferiority thing is really big when compared to men, of course. And second, there is benevolent sexism, which has been defined as apparently positive actions and attitudes towards women, but that are in fact patronizing towards women in reality. So, for example, there's the idea, and this is provided by Kunst et al., that women need to be protected and cherished. Now, that on the surface seems like a positive attitude, but in reality, it's grounded in sexism. Now, hostile and benevolent sexism are typically measured using the ambivalent sexism inventory, which was created by Glick and Fisk in 1996. This is a great measure, and I think it's really good, but I do have an issue with it, and I'd like to ask, is this measure problematic? Specifically because it is from the 1990s, and ideas about sexism have changed since then. Ideas related to gender and sexualities and discrimination and prejudice change a lot over the years. For example, with regard to sexism and racism and things like that, I think there were a lot of things that were more openly acceptable decades ago that are not so acceptable now, and now it's a lot more subtle and maybe more in line with benevolent sexism, if that makes sense. So I'd like to actually reference a study that I recently did, which focused on some scales, and these were scales of adolescent masculinity, and they were made in an American context, and we assessed them in an Irish context, the Republic of Ireland, and essentially found that the scale's structural validity didn't hold up anymore. And we had two potential reasons for this. One was cultural differences, and the other was the fact that the scales were old. And when I say old, I mean like mid 2000s, like 2005-ish, 2006-ish. So I think that that's a really valid point, is that when you're talking about issues like gender and sexualities, things get outdated fast. And I just want to pose the question, do you think that these measures are still valid years later? So now that I've talked about and defined hostile sexism, it's time to move on to rape myth acceptance. And both of these theories, if you want to call them theories, they're more ideas, are related to the Kunst et al. Article, in that they were explained to be reasons why people, and men in particular, oppose Me Too and have negative views towards it. So rape myths. What exactly are rape myths? Well, rape myths are false beliefs used mainly to shift the blame of rape from perpetrators to victims. And that is a quote from Suarez and Gadala. Now, here are some examples of rape myths. For example, women are just asking for it. Victims' claims of rape are false, and men can't be the victims of rape. That last one ties into male rape myths, which are kind of a subsection within the larger category of rape myths. So overall, I think that rape myths are fairly self-explanatory and don't need a lot of defining work. However, there is one question I have for you, and we're actually going to talk about it in the latter half of this video, and that is, how are false beliefs, like rape myths, similar to beliefs in conspiracy theories like those relevant to COVID? So you may recall that we listened to some podcasts and we've been talking about COVID a lot throughout this course. And these podcasts explained, at least one of them explained, why people believe in COVID conspiracy theories. And I thought that was really interesting. And I thought I would try to see how it's similar to how people believe in false beliefs, for example, rape myths. So, with that being said, why do people believe in COVID-19 conspiracy theories and rape myths? So, for the purposes of this particular slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about why people believe in COVID-19 conspiracy theories. I think that the video, or rather the podcast that we listened to, did a very good job of that. So, I'm just going to identify some of the reasons why the people in the podcast said that we believe in COVID-19 conspiracy theories. Then I'll identify the equivalent rape myth reason, and then I'll spend some time talking about the rape myth reason. I think that would be the best way to approach this. So first we have the idea, and they mentioned this in the podcast, that people want certainty and explanations, and they look to conspiracy theories as a readily available option for that. So they see conspiracy theories as an explanation for why COVID-19 is around. Similarly, with rape myths, we have just world theory, and just world theory to me kind of is like karma. It's the idea that those who are the victims of rape deserved it. They did something bad and they deserve to be punished as a result. So people who believe in just world theory use it as an explanation to justify how and why rape happens. And accordingly, that kind of ties into the idea of rape myths. So if you're believing that people get raped because they deserve it, that would be an example of a rape myth. So next up, we have the idea of satisfying social needs for COVID-19 conspiracy theories. So they kind of alluded to this in the podcast, that COVID-19 conspiracy theories and talking with people about it satisfies social needs. On the other side, rape myths can be influenced by others' beliefs, those beliefs around us. So it's kind of the idea that satisfying social needs and others' beliefs, they're both social interactions, they both occur in social settings. So if other people around you tend to believe in rape myths, you're more likely to believe in rape myths as well. And I think that goes for just about anything. If people around you believe in conspiracy theories related to COVID-19, you're more likely to believe in COVID-19 related conspiracy theories as well. And last up, we have exposure to conspiracy theories. So if you're exposed to more conspiracy theories, you're more likely to eventually buy into them and believe them. On the rape myth side of things, we have exposure to, and I put in parentheses, sexually explicit media. Well, some studies have focused on exposure to pornographic material as a leading cause for why people believe in rape myths, and that association has been made clear. Some studies have also looked at and found that exposure to media and television more generally leads to beliefs in rape myths. And I think when you look at the programming that's on TV these days, a lot of it is ultra violent, and it is like, even the news is very dark these days. It's very negative. So I think that connection makes sense. Now, with this being said, we talked a lot about rape myths and a lot about hostile sexism in this particular video, and I'd just like to summarize the Kunst et al. Article again. So basically what they found was that men had more negative attitudes and didn't support Me Too in both Norway and the United States, and they found 3 reasons why this was the case. Lack of feminist identification, belief in rape myth acceptance, and hostile sexism, higher levels of it. So with that being said, you finished the next video. Congratulations. In the last video, I'm going to provide some concluding comments, provide you with some discussion questions, and go from there.